The moment was quiet. No dramatic announcement. No farewell tour filled with speeches or tears. Just a simple truth that slowly reached the public. Alan Jackson, one of country music's most enduring voices, was preparing to step away. Not because he wanted to, but because his body was telling him he had no choice. After decades of standing tall on stage, the man whose songs shaped generations was facing a diagnosis that would change everything. For millions of fans, Alan Jackson had always seemed steady, almost unmovable. His voice carried the weight of tradition, his presence felt permanent. But behind the calm smile and familiar cowboy hat, a silent struggle had already begun, one that would eventually force him to say goodbye to the life he had known. Alan Jackson was never a flashy star. He didn't rely on controversy or spectacle. His music was built on simplicity, honesty, and storytelling. From small-town heartbreaks to patriotic anthems, his songs reflected everyday American life. That was his strength. And it was also why his quiet departure feels so heavy. Born in Newnan, Georgia, Alan Jackson grew up far from the bright lights of Nashville. His childhood was modest. Music wasn't a shortcut to fame, it was an escape, a passion formed in church pews and family living rooms. Country music legends like Hank Williams and Gene Watson shaped his sound, but Alan always remained unmistakably himself. When he finally made it to Nashville, success didn't come overnight. He worked slowly, patiently, believing that real music would eventually find its audience. And it did. By the early 1990s, Alan Jackson was everywhere. His songs weren't just hits, they became part of people's lives. Weddings, funerals, road trips, late nights, and quiet mornings all carried his voice in the background. He wasn't just performing country music, he was preserving it at a time when the genre was rapidly changing. Yet fame never changed his personality. Alan stayed reserved. He avoided Hollywood drama. He rarely chased trends. He believed in tradition, both in music and in life. To fans, he represented stability, a reminder that some things didn't need to change. But time changes everyone. In private, Alan Jackson had been living with a condition that slowly affected his balance and mobility. The diagnosis was Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, a genetic nerve disorder that gradually weakens muscles and affects coordination. It wasn't sudden. It didn't come with one dramatic moment. Instead, it arrived quietly, progressing year after year. At first, it was manageable. Alan continued touring, continued recording, continued standing under stage lights as if nothing was wrong. Most fans never noticed. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want attention. He simply wanted to do his job. But the disease didn't pause for music. As years passed, performing became more difficult. Standing for long periods caused strain. Movement required focus. Balance could no longer be taken for granted. For a performer whose career depended on presence and connection, these changes were deeply personal. Alan Jackson had always believed in dignity. And that belief guided how he handled his illness. He didn't rush to announce it. He didn't frame himself as a victim. When he finally spoke publicly, his words were calm, factual, and honest. He explained that he had been dealing with the condition for years and that it was something he would live with for the rest of his life. There was no dramatic goodbye at that moment. But the meaning was clear. Country music has always valued authenticity, and Alan Jackson embodied that value. When he said he might not be able to tour much longer, fans understood the weight behind those words. Touring wasn't just part of his career, it was his connection to people. It was how he shared stories face to face. The idea of Alan Jackson stepping away from the stage felt unsettling. For decades, he had been a constant presence. He represented a bridge between classic country and modern audiences. Without him, something familiar would be missing. At home, his family stood by him. His marriage, often seen as one of the more stable relationships in the music industry, had weathered its own storms over the years. Through personal struggles and public pressure, Alan and his wife remained together, grounded in faith and shared history. As his health became a greater concern, family took priority over everything else. Alan Jackson never wanted a dramatic exit. He didn't want his illness to define his legacy. To him, the music mattered more than the struggle behind it. But fans couldn't ignore what was happening. Every appearance felt more meaningful. Every performance carried the quiet understanding that it might be one of the last. The phrase, saying goodbye, didn't mean disappearing completely. It meant accepting limits. It meant acknowledging that time, illness, and reality eventually reach everyone, even legends. Alan Jackson's diagnosis didn't erase his achievements. It didn't diminish his influence. If anything, it highlighted the humanity behind the music. He wasn't just a voice on the radio. He was a man facing the same vulnerabilities as anyone else. As comes to a close, one truth remains clear: this goodbye was never about weakness. It was about honesty. Alan Jackson wasn't leaving because he had failed, he was stepping back because life had asked him to slow down. And for a man who spent his life telling honest stories, this may have been the hardest one to share. As the news settled in, fans began to look back differently at Alan Jackson's later years on stage. Movements that once seemed minor now carried meaning. Moments when he stood still for longer stretches were no longer artistic choices, they were necessities. Yet through it all, his voice never faltered. Even as his body weakened, the sound that defined his legacy remained steady. His influence could be heard in younger artists who valued authenticity over image. His songs continued to play on radios, in homes, and in quiet moments across the country. Still, the idea of him no longer performing regularly carried emotional weight. Alan Jackson wasn't just a singer, he was a symbol of continuity. In a genre often divided between old and new, he stood comfortably in the middle, respected by both sides. As his diagnosis became more widely known, fans responded with understanding rather than shock. There was sadness, but also gratitude. Gratitude for the years he gave, the music he shared, and the dignity with which he handled his situation. Alan never asked for sympathy. He never dramatized his condition. He simply acknowledged reality and adjusted his life accordingly. That approach mirrored his music, straightforward, honest, and grounded. At home, his focus shifted further toward family and faith. The demands of constant travel gave way to quieter routines. While the stage had once been central to his identity, it no longer defined him entirely. He had reached a point where presence mattered more than performance. Industry peers spoke of him with deep respect. Not just for his success, but for his consistency. Alan Jackson never reinvented himself to stay relevant. He stayed relevant by staying true. That integrity made his gradual goodbye feel earned rather than forced. There was no final announcement declaring an end to everything. No dramatic farewell speech. Instead, there were fewer dates, shorter tours, and carefully chosen appearances. Each one carried an unspoken understanding between artist and audience. Fans listened more closely. Lyrics felt heavier. Lines about time, memory, and loss took on new meaning. Songs that once sounded nostalgic now felt reflective, even prophetic. Alan Jackson had always written about life as it is, not as people wish it to be. Aging, struggle, and letting go were theme.